Have you ever wondered where some of your favorite bands got their name? Now, to be fair, the days of really well thought up names does seem to be in the past, but there is still a fair share of stories out there that might not be widely known. Like, why in God's name was the Rainbow Butt Monkeys a thing? Okay, then, not obscure enough? How about Rocket Baby Dolls? Johnny and the Moondogs? Ooh, what about Tony, Flo, and the Miraculously Majestic Masters of Mayhem? If you didn't score a 4 out of 4 on that, this episode's for you. Now, some believe that your name actually carries great power, and when you give your name out, you become vulnerable to whomever knows it. That's where the story of Rumpelstiltskin comes from. Despite these ideas being quite archaic and rooted in old fairy tales, you have to admit, names do carry some sort of mystique. They are important. Obviously, they work as an identifier, and they can reach back to pay homage to someone or something. Now, when they refer to a brand, names can become synonymous with quality or lack thereof. Names can inspire confidence. Even if it makes no sense to the brand, it can just go hand in hand with whatever's being sold. And for the most part, the same goes for music. Some bands have names that reflect their music, but with little backstory, like Metallica. More on them in a bit, though. To start, let's go back a little ways. The year is 1964, and a young Vincent Furnier is learning all about his love for music. Curious how many people are actually able to identify the artist off his original name. Anyhow, Vincent Furnier came into music in the mid-60s during a high school talent show. He teamed up with Glenn Buxton, Dennis Dunaway, John Tatum, and John Spear, and in true teenage fashion, the band name was the Earwigs. They made a name for themselves by playing parodies to Beatles songs. And the response was wildly popular. So they decided to start an original band, and they renamed the Spiders. And within a year, they had their first single called Why Don't You Love Me? It was a local hit. By 1967, they began driving to LA to play shows, and once again, a couple personnel changes. They renamed the band the Nazz. The year after that, though, in 1968, they found out that Todd Rundgren already had a band called Nazz, so they once again had to rebrand. And this is about the time that the details get a bit murky. Rumors swirled that the name came from a session with a Ouija board. That was later discredited. Other rumors suggest that it was a witch that was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. The real truth is that Alice Cooper was just meant to be an innocuous and innocent name for a demented and possibly homicidal woman that Furnier would play on stage. And the setup was fantastic. Just imagine some guy playing the role of a woman on stage and getting all weird. That would make headlines. And, well, they weren't wrong, but perhaps a tad differently than they imagined. The headlines that started coming out were referring to them all as a bit of a freak show that maimed farm animals. The band, though, they loved it. The press, it didn't translate into album sales, though. Everyone was just getting out of a decade of love and peace. The circus act wasn't going to dent the charts. So they were signed by Frank Zappa, and after having middling success on the West Coast, they picked up and they moved to Michigan. There, they were picked up by Warner Brothers, hooked up with Bob Ezrin, and went on a spree of hit music. By the way, the stage show was quite the spectacle. They had torture scenes, mock fights, all climaxing in an execution live on stage. This was groundbreaking stuff. But by 1974, the bandmates were kind of done with each other, so they decided to go their separate ways. The big split was announced in 1975, but Vince still wanted to keep Alice Cooper going. So what could he do? The band name wasn't his to claim, so he just went the easy route and legally changed his name to Alice Cooper. Up next, there's actually several names to decipher here as we follow the career of Eric Clapton. He has been at the forefront of blues since he began playing in the 60s, and even on his last tour, still commanded high-tier prices on tickets. Back in the day, when he was weaving in and out of bands, he started in a band called the Roosters, and shortly after had a short stint in a band called Casey Jones and the Engineers, before jumping on board with the Yardbirds. They got their name from either the term for hobos hanging around a rail yard or prisoners, depending on who you ask. Once the Yardbirds switched into more of a pop sound, Clapton made his way into the Bluesbreakers and was in and out with that band for the next year. By this time, he had established his reputation for his guitar work, and he was working his way up to deity status by 1967. This is when he joined one of the first ever recognized supergroups, called Cream. And frankly, in a rare instance of bravado by Clapton, the band was actually named due to their status. Think cream of the crop. A couple years later, though, the band basically broke up and Clapton found himself in another band called Blind Faith. And this name is a bit more tricky. For the first while, the band didn't actually have a name. That's until they decided on their album cover, which was a photo called Blind Faith. And that photo caused a bit of a stir. You see, it featured an 11-year-old girl that was topless. Now, if you're confused, it might be because the US version of that album chose a much different cover. All that aside, Blind Faith was a one-off for Clapton, and over the next year, he played with several different bands before getting sick of the limelight. And with that in mind, he went to work on forming Derek and the Dominoes. Now, at first, Clapton wanted to melt into the background and make vocals the high point of the band, with much less reliance on his guitar work. But the label he was signed to was less impressed with that idea. Now, the initial name of the band was supposed to be Eric Clapton and Friends. Then, in an attempt to nix his name from the project, he went with Del and the Dominoes, which was one of his nicknames at the time. But the name was misread as Derek and the Dominoes, and the rest was history. And even though it was no secret that Clapton was in the band, the label was still not amused that they couldn't use his name as a selling point. So they decided to distribute buttons that said, Derek is Eric. So much for hiding. So if you were a fan of Guns N' Roses in the 80s and 90s, you may already know this story, but still, it's a good one. This is one instance of a very specific name that had an obvious backstory that has kind of been lost over the years. But at the same time, the name has become a brand unto its own. And even without the backstory, it will stand the test of time as one of the best rock acts of the past 35 years. And the numbers speak for themselves. Inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2012, in the first year of eligibility, over 100 million records sold worldwide, with over 45 million of those in North America alone, which makes them the 45th best-selling band of all time. And when the original band reformed in the Not in This Lifetime tour in 2016, they grossed $480 million, which puts it at number 4 on the list of the highest-grossing concert tours of all time. But Guns N' Roses wouldn't have been a thing if it wasn't for LA Guns. You can see where this is going, right? Back in 1984, rhythm guitarist Izzy Stradlin was living with LA Guns founder Tracy Guns. The LA Guns were just starting out and were trying to find a foothold in the music industry, and they were in need of a new singer. Stradlin offered up the name of one of his buddies, Axl Rose. But instead of keeping the original name LA Guns, they decided to make the group a combination of Guns and Roses. Pretty sweet name for an 80s band if you ask me. The first show was played March 26th, 1985, and immediately after, the bassist was flat out fired and Duff McKagan was hired. Things were looking up. An EP was being planned, which would have included the song Don't Cry. Yeah, that song, along with a cover of Heartbreak Hotel and a few others. Then, in Axl Rose fashion, a big fight erupted between Gunn and Rose, and Gunn walked away. Slash ended up replacing him, and, well, you know the rest. Interesting to note, Tracy Gunn went back to his old idea of LA Guns and made a respectable run as a band. But like many other hair bands back in the day, their reign at the top of the charts came crashing down with the arrival of grunge. And if you're curious, despite several breakups, they're still going today. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, Metallica is a bit of a nonsensical name. Sounds cool, yes, but for the sake of the English language, there is no such thing as a Metallica. It's just a name. But where did it come from? Well, the band got its start in 1982 when Lars Ulrich was looking to form a metal band. He placed an ad in the Los Angeles Times asking people to jam out music like the Tigers of Pantang, Iron Maiden, and Diamond Head. Guitarist James Hetfield answered the ad along with Hugh Tanner, both from the band Leather Charm. Now, Leather Charm was a follow-up to the band Phantom Lord, which, if you're a Metallica fan, something just clicked in your head. Now, at this point, they weren't really a band, but they had this great new song they were repeatedly jamming out, so they went and picked up a guy named Lloyd Grant. And with this lineup, they approached Metal Blade Records to see if they could get a song in the new compilation album called Metal Massacre. Hetfield played bass and sang, Lloyd Grant was on lead guitar, and of course, Lars, he was on drums. And the result? Well, the result was interesting. I'll have a link below in case you're interested in hearing it. Now, it wasn't long after the official story of the band picks up, but once again, let's go back to their name. Where did it come from? Back in the early days, as Lars was getting ready to record that initial single, he was hanging out with his buddy Ron Quintana. Now, Ron wanted to start a fanzine, and the two of them were spitballing some names for it. Ron came up with Metal Mania and Metallica. Now, once the name Metallica was off the table, Lars snatched it for a band name, and once again, the rest is blah, blah, blah. Interesting to note, if you ever get your hands on one of those original Metal Massacre albums, the band name was misspelled with 2 T's instead of the single version. That must have pissed Lars off something fierce. Okay, time for a few extras. And if you've been hanging on since the beginning, hoping to find out who those bands were that I mentioned in the intro, here they are. Rainbow Butt Monkeys became Finger 11, but not before they released a very popular track called Circles. The Rocket Baby Dolls, well, that was the name that the Muse took on stage with their first ever show. It was a battle of the bands, and despite winning the show, their name changed shortly after. Now, also, a lot of people already know this already, but Johnny and the Moondogs was one of the original names of the Beatles. They only played a couple gigs under that name before shelving it. And of course, the big one, Tony Flo and the Miraculously Majestic Masters of Mayhem. Well, that band formed in 1983 in LA, and after their first show at the Rhythm Lounge to a total of 30 people, word of mouth got out. The band was already picking up a bunch of steam by the time their second show was booked. So they decided to come up with something that rolled off the tongue, maybe a little bit better. So they settled on the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And to cap off the list, I have to bring this one up. The rumor is when Ed Robertson and Stephen Page started a band, they wanted to make their name something that might draw crowds to the bar. So the rumor is they named themselves Free Beer. However, I cannot find any proof to this claim. In fact, there is a Canadian comedy duo out of Newfoundland that does play some shows under that name. Maybe it's just a big mix-up. But in the end, Robertson and Page still followed through with the clickbaity style name when they did blow up. And much to the chagrin of teenage boys around the world, the band didn't feature a single bare-naked lady.